In 2008–2009, major protests against the Sri Lankan Civil War have taken place in several countries across the world, urging national and world leaders and organizations to take action on bringing a unanimous ceasefire to the Sri Lankan Civil War, which had taken place for over 25 years. The protests took several forms, including human chains, demonstrations, rallies, hunger strikes, and self-immolation. Tamil diaspora communities across the world expressed concerns regarding the conduct of the civil war in the island nation of Sri Lanka. The Civil War, which took place between the Sri Lankan Army and the separatist group Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam, is believed to have claimed the lives of over 100,000 civilians. Protesters and critics of the Sri Lankan government alleged the civil war to be a systematic genocide and ethnic cleansing of the Sri Lankan Tamil minority in Sri Lanka. The first protests occurred in several cities in the Indian state of Tamil Nadu in 2008, where organizations, politicians, celebrities and student associations raised the requests for the government of India to intervene and stop the civil war in Sri Lanka. Following the Tamil Nadu protests began to take place in other cities across the globe. The goal of the protests was to persuade organizations and political leaders to intervene in the Sri Lankan Civil War and establish a ceasefire, appeal to humanitarian aid organizations to provide resources to the affected areas of Sri Lanka, and help remove the LTTE from any list of terrorist organizations. After the civil war was ended on the 18th of May 2009, protests continued in a few countries, urging governments to undertake a war crimes inspection in Sri Lanka. Following increasing protests and outcries in Chennai, predominantly peaceful demonstrations were held concurrently in various cities across the world, such as London, Toronto, Auckland, Ottawa, Paris, Oslo, Sydney, Melbourne, Washington, D.C., Bangalore, New York City, Berlin, Geneva, Zurich, The Hague, Canberra, Wellington, Copenhagen, and Kuala Lumpur. The report of the Secretary-General's panel of experts on accountability in Sri Lanka was compiled and released by the United Nations on war crimes committed on the island. Notable locations: Australia. In Australia, several protests took place in Sydney, Melbourne and Canberra. Over 1,000 protested during Sri Lankan Foreign Minister Rohitha Bogolagama's visit to Australia on the 14th of October 2008. The protest took place in Canberra outside the National Press Club. The protesters accused the Sri Lankan government alleging attack on civilians and the prevention of aid by the United Nations reaching affected areas. In response to the protests, Australian Foreign Minister Stephen Smith stated that he raised the concern of the violence amid the civil war. He also assured that Australia insists that military means will not solve the problem and that a political solution can only result in the ending of the war. After several local demonstrations, mostly in Sydney, larger protests were organised within Australia during the month of April 2009, with the most significant one being the non-stop protest in Sydney. As of April, 60 rallies and protests had occurred across Australia. On the 11th of April, 3 Australian protesters began hunger strikes, like those concurrently occurring in Ottawa and London. The hunger strike ended on the 17th of April. On the 17th of April, a March for Peace took place in Canberra. On the 13th of April, protests took place in front of Prime Minister Kevin Rudd's residence in Sydney, urging him to call an immediate ceasefire. Several hundred protesters rallied in North Sydney urging Joe Hockey, member for North Sydney, to take the concerns of his constituents to the Australian Prime Minister and Foreign Minister. Similar protests occurred occurred on the 22nd of April, as over 600 protesters converged outside Julio Anza's office to voice the frustration at the lack of action by the Australian Labor government in preventing thousands of Tamil civilians from allegedly being killed by the Sri Lankan military. A Boycott Sri Lankan Products campaign was launched in Sydney during the last week of April. The demonstrations occurred with a few roads being closed down to make way. The protests were paused for Anzac Day on the 25th of April. Canada. A series of demonstrations and protests took place in major Canadian cities. The aim was also to create awareness and appeal to leaders, notably the Prime Minister of Canada, Stephen Harper, the President of the United States, Barack Obama, and the Consulate General of Sri Lanka in Canada, Bandula Jayusakara, to take action in ending the conflict. Several Tamil Canadian citizens and business owners from different parts of Canada and the United States took part in major protests set up in Toronto and Ottawa, while smaller-scale demonstrations took place in Montreal, Vancouver and Calgary. The first notable demonstration took place on the 28th of January 2009 in front of the Consulate of Sri Lanka in Toronto, involving a few hundred people. The following day, several thousands gathered in front of the Consulate of the United States in Toronto to appeal to the government of the United States to take action on ending the Civil War. A 5-kilometer human chain of several thousands of citizens took place the next day along major streets in downtown Toronto. Thereafter, demonstrations began to escalate in size and occurred on Parliament Hill in Ottawa for some time, until returning to continue in Toronto. India. In India, protests took place primarily in the Indian state of Tamil Nadu. Protests, rallies, human chains, strikes and demonstrations have continuously taken place throughout the South Indian city of Chennai by lawyers, politicians, activists, student groups, celebrities, and many organizations. The aim of the protests was to urge leaders, such as Chief Minister of Tamil Nadu M. Karunanidhi, Tamil Nadu Opposition J. Jayalalitha, Indian Prime Minister Manmohan Singh and Minister of External Affairs Pranab Mukherjee to intervene and stop the Sri Lankan Civil War and stop any diplomatic assistance or relations with the island nation. Among the first to protest was the South Indian Film Artists Association, who staged a major one-day hunger strike in September 2008. With regard to sentiments among those deceased in the war, several individuals had self-immolated themselves on various days. Those who self-immolated themselves were Madhu Kumar, Murugathasan, Amarezan, Palapati Ravi, Gokularathanam, Tamil Vendan, Shiva Prakasam, Raja, Ravichandran, Ramu, and Sivanandam. Norway had acted as a peace mediator in Sri Lanka prior to it being asked to leave by the Sri Lankan government of Rajapaksa, which ended the ceasefire in 2006 after alleging multiple violations by the LTTE. Pro-LTTE Tamil communities and organizations within Norway organized large protests, including ones outside the Parliament of Norway building, Incognito Gata 18, and other parts of Oslo. There were also protests outside the Sri Lankan embassy, where a few protesters broke into the embassy, making it the first violent movement in Tamil diaspora protests across the world. Although no one was hurt, it did cause severe damage to the embassy of Sri Lanka. Hundreds of Tamils gathered in Bergen, organizing a 48-hour famine protest starting on the 20th of November. United Kingdom. The largest of the protests occurred in the United Kingdom. Protests were organized by the British Tamil Forum, a prominent diaspora organization, and a key association organizing of the event. aiming to encourage British intervention in the Sri Lankan Civil War. The first protest began on the 18th of January 2009 with around 9,000 British Tamils in front of 10 Downing Street in London, participating in a mass vigil. A larger-scaled protest occurred on the 31st of January 2009, which attracted a crowd of around 150,000 Tamils. On the 6th of April an ongoing protest began, which continued into the middle of May. The next major protest took place on the 11th of April 2009, which attracted more than 200,000 Tamils. While the protesters diminished in numbers later on in the day, a number of people took place in non-stop protests on the streets, similar to protests that occurred in Canada. Two British Tamils, 21-year-old Sivathasan Sivakumaravel and 28-year-old Paramaswaran Subramani, went on hunger strike. On the 11th of May, the protesters in Parliament Square spilled through police lines, causing roads to be blocked. With the protesters' noisy but peaceful protests had left the City of London Police with a cost £7.1 million. The British Human Rights Act grants everyone the right to gather with others and protest. In October 2009, the Daily Mail falsely claimed that a police surveillance team had been watching the two hunger strikers, discovered that Subramaniam had been secretly eating McDonald's sandwiches with the help of clandestine deliveries. Subramanian denied the Daily Mail's allegations, calling them entirely baseless and a conspiracy to defame the Tamil struggle. He stated that he also had medical proof. The police refused to discuss the allegations. The false claims were widely reported in the Sri Lankan media, allowing the Sri Lankan government and its supporters used them to condemn the Tamil protesters. Subramaniam then took legal action for libel against the Daily Mail and The Sun, which had repeated the false claims. He won the settlement in June 2010. The newspapers accepted that the claims had been entirely false, apologized to Subramaniam and paid him £77,500 in damages. It was discovered that the United Kingdom sold arms to Sri Lanka worth over £13.6 million in the last 3 years of the conflict, contravening the 1998 Code of Conduct on Arms Exports by the European Union that restricts business with countries facing internal conflicts or with poor human rights records and a history of violating international law. Several members of Parliament expressed anger at the development. 4 committees in the House of Commons expressed concern in a joint statement that arms made in the United Kingdom were fired on civilians during battles in Sri Lanka. In their annual report, the cross-party committees on arms export controls recommended the government should review all arms exports to Sri Lanka following the crackdown on rebels. The MPs also questioned the government's commitment to tackling corruption and bribery and called on ministers to investigate what British-supplied military equipment was used in the campaign against the Tamils. A number of protesters, such as Janjani Yagam of Tamils Against Genocide, reiterated to the BBC that Tamils lived under existential threat in northeastern Sri Lanka, that delayed recognition of genocidal acts cost lives, and that based on its record in Rwanda, the United Nations had not proved that it alone could defend Tamil people.